Majority of the people are aware that God created everything in 6 days. On day 1, he created light and darkness and separated the light and darkness. The light was day, night was dark. On day 2, God created a firmament, which separated the waters from the skies. On day 3, God created the dry ground and the waters. He called the dry ground land and the gathering waters sea. On day 3, God also created plants and trees. On day 4, God created the sun, the moon, and the stars. That would serve a purpose as to tell from which is day and which is night. On day 5, God created every creature of the sea and every bird that could fly. While he was doing that, he also blessed them so that way they could produce more and fill the sea and the sky with more life. On day 6, God created the first human beings, Adam and Eve, and he created all the animals. He created Adam and Eve in his own image and likeness, and also gave them all the animals that they could ever. Adam and Eve were to rule and care for the whole world that they were a part of now. On day 7, God had finally finished his work and he was satisfied with it, so he had rested and made it his own home. This story relates to the story of creation, as God created the first woman, Eve, and the first man, Adam. And he had them live in the Garden of Eden, which made earth like the perfect thing. There was 2 major trees in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. Adam and Eve were told not to eat from the tree of knowledge. That was the warning that God had given them as they were told to tend to the garden. Satan had snuck into the garden disguised as a serpent, so that way he could get Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge. But they knew that they were not supposed to. But Satan, disguised as a serpent, convinced Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge, and he said that their eyes would open up. As Adam believed before that God had said to him, if you eat from the tree in the middle of the garden, you will certainly die. But Satan had convinced her and told her that you will not certainly die, your eyes will be opened. And instead of listening to God, Eve listened to Satan and ate from the tree of knowledge, and then handed some to her husband Adam, and he ate from the tree of knowledge as well. Their eyes were open, but not in a good way. They realized that after they ate the fruit from the tree of knowledge, that they were naked, so they had to make hasty coverings from plants. But then they heard God coming up from behind them. Because they had heard God himself, they had hid from him in the bushes of the garden. Then the Lord had called out to them, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard you in the garden, but I was afraid, so I hid, because I was naked." Then the Lord replied, "Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I had told you not to, that was in the middle of the garden, the tree of knowledge?" He then said, "Yes, the woman had handed me some fruit, and I didn't think it was from there, so I ate it." The Lord said, "What have you done? I had told you not to eat from that tree." The woman replied, "It was the serpent. He deceived me, so I ate it." Then God resumed to put a curse on the serpent and Adam and Eve, and then they were banned from the Garden of Eden. They had put barricades up on all the entrances so that way they could not enter in the future. From that time on, the Bible records the story of salvation, and that he responded to the salvation with his only son, Jesus Christ. God saw how corrupt everything was on the earth, and he realized that he wanted to wipe the whole entire earth of mankind. God wanted to save one man, Noah, and in preparation of him being saved, he told Noah to build an ark. He said that he had to have an entrance on the side and to bring his family in there with him. God also told Noah that he had to have 2 of every animal in there with him, 1 male and 1 female. God also told Noah that he had to have all kinds of food so that way he could have enough food for the animals and his family. Noah completed everything God had told him to do. Once they entered the ark, it started to rain, and it continued to rain and flood for 40 days and 40 nights. As the water began to lessen, the ark had gone on to the mountains, and that's where it stayed. The family had stayed there for weeks just so the water could lessen and the ground could be dry. Before Noah and the family and all the animals had left the ark, Noah had sent out 2 birds, 1 crow and 1 dove. The crow stayed out there, and then once he released the dove, it came back because it didn't have a place to perch. He then waited another week to see what the dove would do, so he released the dove once again. But it still came back because it still couldn't find a place to perch, meaning that the land hadn't dried off enough yet. Once he released it for the 3rd time after waiting another week, The dove stayed out there, and he found a place to perch. Then he came back with an olive leaf, and that's when Noah knew that the water had lessened and that the land was dry. So after that, God had invited them to leave the ark, that it was okay to. So he and all the animals left the ark, and the animals roamed free around the land. Immediately, once God left the ark, he built an altar with burnt offerings, praising the Lord. But the Lord felt bad, and he realized that he shouldn't have destroyed mankind because of how corrupt it was, that he would never do such thing again. Later, God had established a covenant with Noah, and as a sign of the everlasting covenant that they had established, he had placed a rainbow, showing that that would be the sign of their covenant. Abram and Sarai could not have children. Sarai was unable to do so. So Abram and God had made a covenant, and the sign of this covenant was them being circumcised, because that's what Jewish men would do. God had promised Sarai and Abram that he would give them a kid, that Sarai would bear him a child, and their child was to be called Isaac. Although Abram and Sarai didn't believe him, that's what had happened. God had told Abram and Sarai to change their names. Abram changed to Abraham, and Sarai changed to Sarah. Now that Abraham and Sarah have a child named Isaac, God had told Abraham to take Isaac up to the mountain. Abraham took Isaac to the mountain and obeyed the Lord. He was told to prepare a sacrifice for him, so that's what he did. Abraham loved his son, but he knew he had to obey God. The sacrifice was Isaac, and as Abraham was going to kill him, the Lord had stopped him, saying that he had obeyed, that he was truly a man of God that would do anything just to obey the Lord. The story of Moses. We all should know, or we all might know, that Moses was in a basket, and that Moses was adopted by the Pharaoh's own daughter. When Moses was grown, God had told him that he had to command the Pharaoh to let the Jews go, but the Pharaoh didn't listen. So God had found a way to make him understand by using the way of the 10 plagues. So that's what he did. The first plague was waters turned to blood. The second plague was amphibians or frogs. Third plague was gnats or lice. Fourth plague was flies. Fifth plague was the disease on livestock. Sixth plague was the unhealable boils. Seventh plague was hail and fire. Eighth plague was the locusts. Ninth plague was the darkness. And 10th plague was death of the firstborn. As the story continues, God continues to take deaths of the firstborn from the family. But the Jews were told to mark blood from a lamb that they had sacrificed over their doorways so they could see it as a way of protection. In doing that, God had taken the Pharaoh's firstborn son, which then led to him being convinced and letting the Jews go. Soon after the Pharaoh let the Jews go, it ended up with Moses being trapped in the Red Sea. But then God had intervened, and he had freed Moses along with everybody else. They were stuck in the desert for 40 years. During those 40 years, while Moses was freed, he had climbed up to Mount Sinai and received the 10 Commandments. But while Moses was on his journey, the Israelites had decided to create a golden calf and worship him, which was worshiping a false god, which was forbidden. This is the story of David. The Philistines and the Israelites were getting ready for war. They were fighting. And then, as they were fighting, Goliath had called out for someone, a man from the opposing side. David was begging his leader to let him fight him, and his leader finally agreed. So that's what he did. He fought Goliath successfully, although he was terrified. He killed Goliath and got a sword and cut off his head. After he cut off his head, he picked up the head of the dead body of Goliath and showed it to the Israelites, saying that he was dead. He was gone. But then they all ran away because they were scared of what might happen next, because Goliath was no longer around. The Philistines wanted to attack him because he was the one who had killed Goliath. But then he reached out to his bag and took out a stone. Then he slung it and struck a Philistine on the forehead. The stone hit and was able to sink into his forehead, and he fell down on the ground. David was happy, and he jumped over the Philistine with another sling of a stone. Without a sword, he was able to strike down on the Philistine and kill him. Once he had the head in his hand, he took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. He then put the Philistine's weapons in his own tent. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" He then replied, "As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know." The king said, "Find out whose son this young man is." As soon as David returned from the killing of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. Saul asked, "Whose son are you, young man?" David said, "I am the son of your servant, Jesse of Bethlehem." This is the story of Jesus. The angel Gabriel was sent down to tell a woman named Mary that she was going to have a son that would rule the kingdom one day. The child named Jesus was born in a stable. Because he was born in the stable, shepherds were able to visit him. Then there was a bright shining star who had guided men from the east to visit this young newborn child. We learned that there was efforts to kill Jesus, but he was then saved. Then we learn more about Jesus when he was 12. When he was 12, he would talk to the teachers in the temple asking about the Lord. About 18 years later, Jesus was baptized, and then he began to preach and teach for the kingdom. He also had work to be completed that God had set him to do on earth, so that's what he was doing. To help him with his work that God had set him to do, Jesus was able to choose 12 men, and they were named his apostles. Jesus performed his work that God had sent him to do, and in doing that, he also performed some miracles. He was able to feed thousands of people with just a couple small fish and a couple pieces of bread. He was also able to heal the people and even raise from the dead. Then we learned about how Jesus had sacrificed his life for us on the last day of his life. He carried the cross for us. He fell 3 times, and he had a crown of thorns worn out on his head. He was then nailed to the cross and sacrificed his life for us. 2 days later, he died on the cross. After he died on the cross, he ascended right into heaven. As soon as he ascended into heaven, he was seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty.